There's no way you do that. Pain in hell has two sides. The kind you can touch with your hand, the kind you can feel in your heart. Your soul, the spiritual side. And you know, the worst of the two is the spiritual.
I'm leaf twisted, but still kill your whole belief system. I speak wisdom, translated to street diction. A past victim of the governmental grapple. Now I slash you on the
1. Reminiscing of his life in the fur trade, BeckWourth ended his autobiography discussing the U.S. government's desire to exterminate the Native American race. Speaking of his time with the Crow and under tutelage of men such as General William Ashley, founder of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, BeckWourth attempted to relay his understanding of tribal culture, where it should be remembered, when judging of their acts, that they consider the country they inhabit as the gift of the Great Spirit. 2. However, BeckWourth acquiesced. If the government is determined to make war upon the Western tribes, let it be done intelligently. 3. Western narratives from fur trappers. Famous for his short stories, Irving depicted the life of Benjamin Bonneville, the French-American trapper. Although written as a non-fiction, historians have reclassified the book as largely a work of fiction with elements of truth. 5. Irving's work is important due to its introduction of elements prominent in fur trapper tales. Romanticism, the depiction of the noble savage and a mythologizing of the mountain man as an aspect of Jacksonian nationalism. T.D. Bonner's autobiography of James P. BeckWourth was fascinating for both its similarities to Irving's work and its differences. BeckWourth's autobiography was known for its inclusion of violence while at the same time emphasizing the mythology of the mountain man. 6. BeckWourth's autobiography and Irving's tale of Bonneville echoed many different contemporaneous works, whether based in fact or fiction. Therefore, this source is more of a synthesis that provides a general overview of the many different frameworks to study the trade. Primary sources have been re-examined using a variety of different frameworks throughout the last century and a half. These fresh approaches have allowed historians to view evidence with a different mindset and come up with different conclusions on the history of trade. Although the fur trade has always been, in a sense, racially fluid in nature, it is only with the rise of Jacksonian nationalism in the 1820s and 1830s that the Western fur trade became insular from the rest of country, leaving space for relationships between trappers and Native Americans. James BeckWourth, 1798 to 1866, is a fascinating subject when studying relationships between early 19th fur traders and Native Americans. A freed slave, he traveled west in the early 1820s and joined William Ashley's Rocky Mountain Fur Company, which began its operations in St. Louis, MO in 1822. The most fascinating aspect of BeckWourth's life was his claim that the Crow not only welcomed him into their tribe as one of their own but also made him their chief.
Was his claim that the Crow not only welcomed him into their tribe as one of their own but also made him their chief.
Chapter I. Savages. Depictions of race in the 19th century fur trade. James P. BeckWourth wrote of his experience with Native American tribes during his time as a fur trapper in the 1820s and 1830s, where one man would be spared, as I have been, to pass through the perils of fasting, the encounters with the savage, and the fury of the wild beasts, and still preserve his life. They would die in the wilderness, either in solitude, or with the fiendish savage shrieking in revolting triumph in his ear. In talking about the savage, BeckWourth typified common perceptions of the Native American race. BeckWourth's vilification of the savage was common during the early 19th century. Fur trappers such as BeckWourth reflected aspects of radicalized views while ideas such as American nationalism grew in the United States politic. The rise of President Andrew Jackson and the normalization of racial values in the political sphere emphasized an environment of exclusivity. Interactions between fur trappers and the savage tribes vindicated the racial views prominent in America in the early 19th century, and a rejection of it. This chapter will analyze examples of several trappers, such as James P. BeckWourth and Warren Angus Ferris, to demonstrate how their relationships were influenced by these racial ideals, particularly the idea of the savage. James P. BeckWourth was an African-American fur trapper who served at one time or another with both the Rocky Mountain Fur Company and the American Fur Company, two prominent fur trapping companies in the early 19th century. BeckWourth argued hesitantly for the destruction of the Native American race. He stated in his autobiography, "If it is the policy of government to utterly exterminate the Indian race, the most expeditious manner of effacing this ought to be the one adopted." 34. He asserted that creating a dependency of the Native Americans on U.S. goods and services, such as alcohol, would eventually bring their ruin. Parallel to the development of racial ideologies in the early 19th century was the rise of American nationalism, which inevitably placed Native Americans in opposition to the masculine, American ideal that mountain men came to represent in the age of Jackson. Early wars contributed to the development of American identity. The French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, also known as the 7 Years' War, was critical to formation of the Revolution and relationships with Native American tribes in the area. The War of 1812 marked a turning point not only for American nationalism but for America's attitude toward Native Americans. With lands east of the Mississippi acquired from the British, the U.S. government no longer had to fear a British-Native American alliance to stifle westward expansion. Following the War of 1812, Americans needed to define what it meant to be American, and Native American citizenship posed a problem to that identity. 35-year-old Martin Chittenden also emphasized the connection between race and nationality, claiming that the Aboriginal tribes were doomed to complete. 34 Bonner, 533, 35 Bonner, 7, Mitchelson 19. Page. 20 of 59. Displacement on the soil of their nativity after once the European race had discovered this continent is a position that few will care to deny, but the change was inevitable as the progress of the stars. 36 American settlement was justifiable, and a God-given right. Through civilization and the incorporation of Native Americans, the white race utilized ideals of nationalism and romance to justify their treatment of Native Americans not as sovereign nations, but as an inferior race. 37 BeckWourth's internalization of these values only mirrored concepts of racial and national identity established in the era. Fur trappers reflected aspects of the mainstream view of Native Americans as savages. As both a fur trapper and adopted member of the Crow tribe, BeckWourth's opinions on Native Americans varied widely. He spoke of his adopted tribe, the Crow, in kind words. They, the Crow, were constantly at war with tribes who coveted the scalps of the white man, but the Crows were uniformly faithful in their obligations to my race, and would rather serve than injure their white brethren without any consideration. Were uniformly faithful in their obligations to my race, and would rather serve than injure their white brethren without any consideration of profit. 38 BeckWourth's assertion that the Crow would rather serve indicated a dependency on the white trappers and traders. Perhaps BeckWourth's boasting of the Crow's subservience to whites was to prove his loyalty to the American Fur Company, with whom he and the Crow tribe worked. BeckWourth considered the Pawnee the most degraded, and held in such contempt. He also warned of the Sioux, who in extreme danger coalesce and engage in war. 39 He was not hesitant to refer to the race of Native Americans, calling them at times the Red Man. He ended his autobiography with instructions on how he thought the U.S. Army best defeat the Indian race in the 1850s and beyond. BeckWourth's conclusion of his long autobiography boasted of his interactions with the savage. 36 Chittenden, 11. 37 Berger 38 Bonner, 198. 39 Bonner, 531 532. Mitchelson 20. He and BeckWourth's opinions on the savage race aligned with the fur companies who employed them, the Rocky Mountain Fur Company and the American Fur Company, whose hired trappers lived their day too. Day lives in the shadow of American nationalism, as BeckWourth discussed the ability of the mountain man to adapt to the environment of the Native Americans. He also argued its usefulness for the destruction of what he refers to as the Red Man. It is only by men possessing qualities of the white hunter, combined with Indian habits, the Indians can effectually and economically conquered. 43 The stereotypes perpetuated by BeckWourth and Warren Angus Ferris echo dominating perceptions of native. 40 Bonner, 536. 41 Warren Angus Ferris, Life in the Rocky Mountains, A Diary of Wanderings of the Sources of the Rivers Missouri, Columbia, and Colorado 1830 to 1835 revised by Fred A. Rosenstock, Denver, CO. The Old West Publishing Company, 1983. 42 Ferris, 388. 43 Bonner, 555. Mitchelson 21. Page 22 of 59. Americans during the time. Aside from the stereotypes relayed by trappers such as BeckWourth and Ferris, the era also popularized stereotypes about the trappers themselves, eulogized as the mountain men. Fur trapper stereotypes about their appearance, behavior, and daily lives contributed both to contemporary views of the mountain man and his place in American mythology. Modern historian David F. Wishart attempted to describe the character of the fur trapper in an overview of the Western fur trade, where he established three stereotypes of the Rocky Mountain fur trappers: the epic hero who tamed the wilderness, the outsider criminal escaping the rigid structures of civilized society, and what he considers the most tenable, the W.H. Goatsman Jacksonian man, an expectant capitalist like most other Americans at the time. 44 The implications of the three stereotypes created an ambiguous environment, where not one but all three of the stereotypes engaged in the trade. In line with the economic initiative of the trade, mountain men as expectant capitalists or even epic heroes supported the Jeffersonian idea of settlement in the West. Men, such as James BeckWourth, traveled to often hostile territory in pursuit of both adventure and monetary success. Likewise, distinctions between free trappers and trappers employed by a particular company embodied different stereotypes. For example, trapper Joseph Meek wrote of free trappers and their extravagance. He regarded himself as greatly superior of either of the foregoing classes. He had his own horses and accoutrements, arms and ammunition. He took what Rudy thought fit, hunted and trapped when and where he chose, traded with the Indians, sold his furs to whoever offered highest for them, dressed flauntingly, and generally had an Indian wife and half-breed children. 45. Meek's description of the free trapper emphasized stark differences between the free trapper and employed trapper, primarily in their acquisition of wealth. 44 Lewis and Clark and the Indian Country, 195-196. 45 Lewis and Clark and the Indian Country, 227. Meekins had at the time of fabled mountain men, William H. Ashley, founder of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, led men such as James BeckWourth, Hugh Glass, and Jedediah Smith, to name a few, into the West. The Jacksonian era of American nationalism provides alternative context to racial fluidity in the Rocky Mountain fur trade. As Mark Allen Sigmund pointed out, the mountain man would be lionized in the Jacksonian world while thriving in the natural world. This form of romantic nostalgia formed the basis for many interpretations of the trade and the relationships the trappers was welcomed by the tribe due to his relationship with the chief's daughter. Complications arose as tensions mounted between the tribe and other white trappers. After camping with the Blackfeet at the post for several days, a party of braves entered the camp with 3 white men's scalps. BeckWourth lamented that the sight of them made my blood boil with rage, but there wasn't help of it, so I determined to wait with patience my day of revenge. 75 Despite BeckWourth's new place in the tribe, his insistence of his desire for revenge indicated that he felt kinship with the white trappers. Square, thin stroke, solid. Much has been said about James BeckWourth's appearance, including whether or not his features were white or not. Family biographer, Paul BeckWourth, stated in his History of the BeckWourth Family, the BeckWourths, that Jennings married a woman named Miss Kill, who he believes to be BeckWourth's mother. 112. However, there is no mention of a mixed marriage, which leads modern historian Eleanor Wilson to argue that Paul BeckWourth knew very little about that side of the family. Wilson concedes, however, that it is common consensus among historians that BeckWourth was at least part African American. She cites court records that list BeckWourth as a slave, although his father did not treat him like one. When BeckWourth decided to leave St. Louis to go west, Jennings BeckWourth appeared on 3 separate occasions in open court and acknowledged the execution of a deed of emancipation from him to James, a mulatto boy. 113. His relationship with his father, who did not seemingly treat him as a slave, may have played a part in how BeckWourth saw himself. Modern historians and popular writers have used a variety of terms to characterize BeckWourth. Eric J. Dolan says, he might have passed for white, but chose to live as a black man. 114. Eleanor Wilson in her autobiography of BeckWourth uses primary sources such as Watt, Meredith T. Moore saw of BeckWourth in California, to argue that although BeckWourth doesn't overtly mention racism in his own autobiography, other sources from the era refer to him as a mongrel. She also discusses how his supposed white features were a reason why contemporaries didn't mention his mulatto ancestry. 115. Any racism against BeckWourth in his own time would seem to negate the possibility of the fur trade as a racially fluid environment isolated from the rest of the country. However, BeckWourth's freedom and interactions with the American Fur Company, Rocky Mountain Fur Company, and leadership among the Crows, even although contemporary trappers and explorers such as Warren Angus Ferris often considered BeckWourth a liar and thin stroke, solid, to accumulate wealth quickly. Their discretions with Native American women served not only as a form of eroticism but also as a practical move to secure their own safety in Native American territory. As James BeckWourth discussed the ability of the mountain men to adapt to the environment of the Native Americans, he also argued its usefulness for the destruction of what he refers to as the red man. It is only by men possessing the qualities of the white hunter, combined with Indian habits, that the Indians can be effectually and economically conquered. 118. Thus, after reading a romantic tale of BeckWourth's journey, his declaration of being an American citizen and a friend of the white race, which he also referred to as his, was used to give advice on how best to destroy the
Native American race he lived with for years.
For the next 8 to 9 years, BeckWourth lived with the Crow band. He rose in their society from warrior to chief, a respected man, and leader of the Dog clan. According to his book, he eventually ascended to the highest-ranking war chieftaincy of the Crow Nation. 6. He still trapped but did not sell his or Crow furs to his former partners of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. Later that year, BeckWourth claimed to have been captured by Crow Indians while trapping in the border county between the territories of Crow, Cheyenne, and Blackfoot. According to his account, he was mistaken for the lost son of a Crow chief, so they admitted him to the nation. Independent accounts suggest his stay with the Crow was planned by the Rocky Mountain Fur Company to advance its trade with the tribe. 5. BeckWourth married the daughter of a chief, and may have had multiple wives. Marriages between Native Americans and fur trappers and traders were common for the valuable alliances they provided both parties. In 1837, when the American Fur Company did not renew his contract, BeckWourth returned to St. Louis. He volunteered with the United States Army to fight in the Second Seminole War in Florida. In his book, he claimed to have been a soldier and courier. According to historical records, he was a civilian wagon master in the baggage division.
According to historical records, he was a civilian wagon master in the baggage division.
7. From 1838 to 1840, BeckWourth was an Indian trader to the Cheyenne, on the Arkansas River, working out of Fort Vasquez, Colorado, near Platteville. In 1840, he moved to the Bent and St. Vrain Company. The Bent brothers built Fort Bent on the Arkansas River. Later that same year, BeckWourth became an independent trader. Together with other partners, he built a trading post in Colorado. It was the center of development of the community of Pueblo, Colorado. In 1844, BeckWourth traded on the old Spanish Trail between the Arkansas River and California, then controlled by Mexico. When the Mexican-American War began in 1846, BeckWourth returned to the United States. He brought along nearly 1,800 stolen Mexican horses as spoils of war. In the war, he served as a courier with the U.S. Army and helped suppress the Taos Revolt. His former employer, Charles Bent, then interim governor of New Mexico, was slain in that revolt. In 1859, BeckWourth returned to Missouri briefly, but settled later that year in Denver, Colorado Territory. He was a storekeeper and was appointed as a local U.S. agent for Indian Affairs. In 1864, BeckWourth was hired as a scout by Colonel John M. Chivington, commander of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry Regiment. He was to serve in a campaign against the Cheyenne and Apache, leading a frontier paramilitary volunteer militia formed to annihilate indigenous inhabitants in the territory for the American settlers. The Colorado Territory campaign resulted in the Sand Creek Massacre, in which the hostile militia killed an estimated 7,163 friendly Cheyenne men, women and children, who had camped in an area suggested by the previous commander of Fort Leon as a safe place and were flying an American flag to show their peaceful intentions. Outraged by his association with the massacre, the Cheyenne banned BeckWourth from trading with them. Well into his 60s by then, BeckWourth returned to trapping. In 1866 during Red Cloud's War, the U.S. Army employed him as a scout at Fort Laramie and Fort Phil Kearny.
Fortunately, some say I possess a Jedi mind, so the force is with me when I rhyme. So that makes me spit a fresh one. So when threat is done, even an atheist will say I blessed them.